All right, Doug, today I was hoping to talk about something that is, outside of polite discourse. You're not supposed to talk about anarchy and anarchism. And I think the reason mainly for that is because when people think of anarchy and anarchism, especially today, they look at Antifa, they look at, because they claim to be anarchists and they are sowing chaos and disorder and destruction. Is that what we should think of when we think of anarchy?
No, it's completely embarrassing to see these idiots term themselves and the media terming them as anarchists. I mean, got to define what is anarchism. I mean, it comes from the Greek a, which means no, and archy, which means rule. But it's not talking about chaos. It's not talking about a lack of order. It simply means no ruler is what it means. Like monarchy is one ruler. So instead of one ruler, you have no ruler. And there are actually two schools of anarchy. It's rather strange. The European school and the American school, believe it or not. And historically, the reason why anarchy's gotten a bad name is because a lot of the Europeans were actually communists that considered themselves overtly violent. And there are a lot of names like Bakunin and Kropotkin and Proudhon and Malatesta were all European anarchists. And it's very odd because for years in my newsletter, as an end note, I would often quote Mikhail Bakunin or Peter Kropotkin, because why would I quote them? Because on social matters, they were just golden. They understood perfectly the idea of personal and social freedom. But when it came to economics, they were socialists or communists, and which makes no sense at all. To believe in social freedom and not believe in economic freedom. Because if you don't have economic freedom, it means that you don't have the capital, you don't have the means to engage in very much social freedom at all. So
Well,
it's really rather crazy. You know, I don't have a chart that I can hold up, but there was there's a 5-question test to take to determine whether you're a libertarian or not. Have you ever seen this?
I don't recall. No, I probably have, but I don't recall it.
Okay, I don't have it. It may be on the internet. But the interesting thing about it is it allows you to put yourself on a graph. And the x-axis, as I recall, is social freedom, going from totalitarian to anarchist, total freedom, and economic freedom, going from communist to anarchist on the other hand. So it's a question of how much freedom you believe in these two things, the economic freedom or the social freedom. And you can find out where you are on the graph. If you're a centrist, it means you believe in some economic freedom and some social freedom. If you're a communist, you don't believe in any kind of freedom. It's a very interesting little graph. And of course, when you gauge freedom, which is that's the sine qua non about everything with politics. I mean, politics boils down to how do you feel about personal freedom? Do you like it or not? And then you got to break down freedom to these two areas, social and economic. And unfortunately, when people look at this left-right spectrum, of course they can't think clearly because what is left and what is right, these things are always changing. They're floating abstractions. And, historically, well, not historically, but most of the time, I guess, you were a rightist if you believed in, or you talked the talk for economic freedom, but you definitely didn't believe in social freedom. And you were a leftist if you definitely didn't believe in economics freedom, but you talk the talk for social freedom. But this is a false dichotomy. What if you believe in both kinds of freedom? That makes you neither left nor right.
Right.
Which is why I don't like to say left or right, because it's confusing. They're ill-defined and people don't know what they're talking about. And if you can't define a word accurately, then that means you really don't know what you're talking about. And the person you're talking to probably doesn't either. So no wonder people get into disagreements and loggerheads and that, because they cannot understand each other using the wrong definitions for words. Now, there was a friend of mine named Robert Lefebvre, and he had his day in the sun. I don't know if he's well known anymore, but he refused. He was an anarchist, but he refused to use the word anarchist because it's developed such a bad reputation among the hoi polloi. So he preferred to call himself an autarchist, which means auto, from self-rule. Okay, I can live with that. But at the same time, I don't like to see the bad guys steal and abuse another perfectly good word. I mean, they did that with liberal, where liberal from liber, free, and today, if you're a liberal, you're the opposite. I mean, you don't believe in any kind of freedom, quite frankly. So they've taken it, turned it upside down. So even democracy, I mean, at one point, it could have been said to be a decent word, demos, the people. But democracy today is not people's rule, it's mob rule. And it's shunting off of your personal responsibility to some elected bureaucrats who are then going to rule you. So,
well, that's the big thing, isn't
everything
it?
is screwed up definitionally to start with.
In anarchism, isn't the core thing essentially that you have to accept full personal responsibility, and that is, when you believe, so that's, well, with freedom comes responsibility. So on one side of the spectrum, you have that individual freedom, and then on the other side, you have you have statism, or you're basically giving that you're giving up your freedom, to the state or whatever, in exchange for protections and the offloading essentially of responsibilities.
Yes, exactly. And that's right. Statism allows you to offload your personal responsibility and give it to the state. But unfortunately, the state's about the worst thing you can give anything to, because you've got to ask yourself, what kind of people are drawn to work for the state? Now, there's a lot of ways of dividing the kind of people in the world. But from this point of view, the best way is you've got people that believe in voluntary relationships with their fellow men, and people that like to use coercion. Let's divide people that way. So if the state is institutionalized coercion, that's what it's all about. I mean, as Mao said, the state comes out of the barrel of a gun. There's no volunteerism about the state. They can pretend, but if you don't do what the state tells you to do, they will hold a gun to your head. They will haul you away. They'll put you in jail. They'll take your property. And if you're really naughty, they'll kill you. So it's an intrinsically evil institution from that point of view, the state. And the type of people that want to go to work for the state, the government, if you would, the state and the government, are the kind of people that think that's just fine. I mean, not just to take orders from the state, but to actually join it and put on the armbands and the black uniforms and enforce the state's rules. So I prefer to stay away. I mean, there are people that work for the state, the government, they call themselves public servants. This is complete nonsense. They go to work for the state because they like bossing other people around. It's a great way to enrich yourself. I mean, everybody in Congress, they weren't a multimillionaire before they got into it. They're a centimillionaire by the time they get out of it.
Mm.
Lots of examples of that. So you get the poorest and the worst kind of people that go to work for the government, yet, these silly chimpanzees idealize them and call them their rulers and listen to what they say. I mean, it's absolutely embarrassing.
What do you think it is about humans that makes
most of your fellows are like that?
What do you think it is that where humans seem to like having rulers? It's like almost a preferred state for man. You see rulers celebrated, and people want to follow somebody. They don't it doesn't seem to be a natural instinct necessarily among people to really be free, to really have radical personal responsibility. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because they're uncomfortable with the idea of having to control their own lives. I mean, it's so much easier to in effect be an overage child and have people, look, this is why people like socialism. Actually, the family, which the socialists want to abolish, if you read the Communist Manifesto and listen to a lot of what the Antifa people say, they want to abolish the nuclear family, which is really very strange because the nuclear family is actually a socialist institution. You've got the boss, and he supplies food, shelter, and clothing to the little people in the family below him. And, not much responsibility. You do what you're told. And I guess it's nice being a kid, kind of, sometimes for most people.
Yeah.
And they figured that, gee, I'll replace my father and mother with the state. They'll take good care of me. It's infantile, completely irresponsible.
Do you think that people want, is it, we talked in a different conversation about the fact that people don't seem to trust other people, and so they feel like they need government, they need rules, or else, the worst nature of people is going to come out and it'll harm them. They believe in this Hobbesian view of others, it seems. Why do they seem to think that people are dangerous and yet the government is not? The government, which is, of course, people say, well, it's comprised of people. It's so, but why do they seem to think that it's okay that the state somehow can protect them, but that other people can't be trusted?
Yeah, it's really strange because the state is institutionalized coercion. That is its whole nature. So why do people glom onto that? It's a psychological aberration. That's the best way I can describe it. In other words, a truly healthy, self-actuated human being is responsible for his own life, and he takes responsibility instead of giving it off to some magical entity, whether it's the spaghetti monster in the sky or the state, and hoping that it'll kiss it all and make it better. I mean, even Ayn Rand, and I'm a big fan of Ayn Rand's thinking. I mean, she really was a genius, but even she didn't go far enough. I know it's very odd when anybody, Rand didn't go far enough, and the answer is no, she didn't, because she believed that there was a reason for a state, and she had her reasoning for believing that was good as far as it went. She said, look, we're trying to limit coercion in the society. So therefore, the state should be there for no reason other than to limit coercion. Okay, if that's all it did, I could live in a state like that. You limit coercion from outside the state's bailiwick with the military. Okay, that makes sense. You limit coercion within its bailiwick with police. Okay, that makes sense. And you allow people to adjudicate disputes with each other without resorting to coercion with the court system. And if that's all the state did, you know what, even as an anarchist, I suppose I could live with that, no problem. That'd be such a vast improvement over what we have today. But in today's world, the state does all three of those things extremely poorly, dangerously poorly.
Mm,
And it tries to do absolutely everything else.
mm.
So, this is funny. You say, well, we have a constitution to tell us what the state should do and shouldn't do. And yeah, that's funny. It's like my friend Butler Schaefer, who recently kicked the bucket, said, yeah, right, we have a constitution. It keeps the government from doing all the horrible things that it does every day to us.
Right. Yeah. What the thing with the government also is it seems like people are so involved in this left-right dichotomy, this tribalism almost of these two sides. Does it actually, I mean, maybe I'm answering the question by asking it, but I want your thoughts on like, how much of a difference it even makes which side, if you're coming from that left-right dichotomy, does it make any difference about whether a government can be good or bad? You know what I mean? Like, because some people say, well, if they had certain laws, it'd be better. If we were more conservative on, certain issues, it'd be better. But really, it seems like that hasn't gotten us anywhere. It's just made things more statist over my lifetime, at least.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's the difference between the left and the right? I mean, on the conventional scale, which, as I've said before, I'd throw out, it's a question of whether you're more interested in being controlled socially or being controlled economically. I mean, this is what you call Hobson's choice. I mean, it's a horrible choice to be confronted with. The whole thing is phony. And anyway, I would say, look, the only reason that you need the state, if you need it, it's basically because of the psychological aberrations that a lot of people have. Their psychologies are so bent, they probably feel they need to be controlled, and therefore everybody else needs to be controlled. Americans have really glommed onto the see something, say something thing.
Yeah.
We've become a nation of snitches. I mean, even in a prison, about the worst thing you can be in a prison, other than a child molester, is a snitch. But you get outside of a prison, and everybody's encouraged to be a snitch, to turn people in for any number of crimes. So we live in an upside down world where in some ways prisons are more ethical than the outside world.
Well, a lot of people will think that when you think about anarchy, they go, well, I mean, how can it really ever work? Because how could it ever work especially if you talk about it with all the psychological problems that people must have, or they want to be ruled, they want their freedoms limited so they can be protected. And so that because other people can't be trusted, how would things, well, just as a specific example, when we had, when these riots were happening with BLM and Antifa, the police just totally stood down. And the result of that was, I mean, it really was violence and destruction. And so I think what most people think is if the state stands down, they are, or, the cops would say the thin blue line, between civilization and chaos. They say is them. And when they stepped aside like that, there was chaos. But why isn't that? Why isn't
well, to start with, look, the police force, we'd be much better off, even in a situation like that, with a privatized police force than we are with the state police force, because we might have talked about this the other day, is that the police and the military, their first obligation is to their buddies. That's laudable, it's understandable. The second obligation is to their employer, and only third and last, it's the people they're supposed to serve and protect. So it's much better to have these people motivated by the profit motive. In other words, Today, who joins the police force? Well, you get way too many guys that have an extra Y chromosome. They're
Mm.
overly aggressive. Maybe a lot of cops, frankly, like the idea of wearing a costume and getting to beat up on people that they can consider bad guys. They have no personal responsibility. I mean, cops today, and I'm not anti-police, they're necessary. Uh, I'm not for defunding the police or anything like that, but we have to recognize what we're dealing with. And it would be better if, a beat cop is replaced by a Mannix or a Mike Hammer or somebody like that, that is is has to be personally responsible. If he does something that's unethical or criminal, he's treated like just another citizen, but a citizen that has taken upon himself the job of tracking down criminals.
Mm.
So I think that's a much better solution than a paramilitary organization with which tends to draw a lot of bad apples to itself. Anyway, look, what holds society together isn't a cop standing on the corner watching everybody. What holds a civilized society together is peer pressure and moral suasion and social approbation. That's why when you go to a restaurant, everybody generally acts in a civilized way, doesn't get up and do a dance on the table and then run out without paying their bill. Those things are what hold society together, not the fear of a cop putting them in jail if they destroy, if they don't pay their bill in a restaurant. I mean, that's just the way, except a small number of criminal people, and you need a small number of police to keep them under control.
Right. I think that I think and talk often to people about the idea that the only reason that that people it isn't the laws that make people behave in a certain way. People are just choosing to behave that way because the enforcement of the laws can never be enforced across the large population, especially the incredible number of laws there are. There could not possibly be enforcement. So it's a system that relies heavily on voluntary compliance, and that voluntary compliance is based upon those, like you said, peer pressure and just the cultural norms and things like that. That would encourage people to do the right thing. It's not the fear of punishment so much as just just choosing to behave and to get a long way with your neighbors, that keeps people from committing most crimes.
Absolutely. And instead, though, people are happy to trade their personal freedom and half of their incomes to an institution that specializes in war. I mean, war is the health of the state. It's what the state specializes in. Taxes, which coercively steal any amount of income from you and will punish you hugely if you don't pay them. Regulations where you have little bed bugs running around everywhere telling you what to do and what not to do, in addition to things like pogroms and mass persecutions. I mean,
Yeah.
it is perfectly horrible, but people pledge allegiance to it. It's actually rather shocking.
I want to talk about the difference between country and government in a moment, but I think one of the things that really when I'm talking to people about the risk of government is really high. Like for an individual, like the government is most likely to harm you, over enough time. Civilizations or peoples have been slaughtered on a mass scale by governments, and so one thing I say is it's illegal is not the same as right or wrong. You know what I mean? Like, so just because something is legal does not make it right. In fact, it's just it's often some arbitrary current state or current view of the government. And I think the example I like is, of course, everyone knows it was legal to own slaves, and slavery was it was immoral and yet unethical, and yet it was totally legal and totally fine by the state. And uh, to push that point further, in the Jim Crow South, if you owned a restaurant and you wanted, because for economic reasons, if nothing else, forget about that, even if it ethical or moral, for economic reasons, you did not want to have a separate area for blacks and whites. Instead, you tried to seat them at the same counter. That was illegal for you to do that. You would be punished. You could be imprisoned if you dared to allow whites to sit in the same area as blacks. And so the law was clearly doing something that is obviously now totally unethical, but then it was right.
Yep, absolutely correct. And the fact of the matter is, in day-to-day commerce, and I've grown up a lot in the South, in Virginia and Maryland, which was actually a southern state, that blacks and whites as individuals actually always got along quite fine. But as you pointed out, it was these laws that made the difference between them. It was a law that blacks couldn't drink out of this water fountain. It was a law that blacks had to ride in the back of the bus. But absent the laws, I don't think most people would have cared, even back then.
Yeah, and I think that's what people don't understand. People think that they had to be, forced to do the right thing. You had to force these Jim Crow laws, these Jim Crow attitudes away, but they don't understand that was the state that created that immoral situation and maintained it anyway. So
yeah, the thing is, the government is always passing these laws. And who passes these laws? It's the people that are elected to legislative bodies, who really tend to be the most dangerous type of people in society. They're the kind of people that actually think they've got a moral right to tell other people what to do. So they pass, no man's life or property is safe when the legislature is in session. And so how many laws do you need if you're going to have an anarchy as a practical thing? And This is not a utopian idea at all. It's simply the free market in action is what an anarchy actually is. I almost forgot. I started talking about the European and the American traditions of anarchy. And I mentioned the Europeans. And the American tradition of anarchy is very different from the European tradition. These are people like Lysander Spooner and Benjamin Tucker and Albert J. Nock. And they were free market anarchists that believed in both economic freedom and social freedom. And it's very funny, in today's America, you've got all kinds of idiots like Edward Abbey, the ecological terrorist, and Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, the hippies from the 60s. They called themselves anarchists. No wonder you got a bad name about that. But, and actually, it's also why that, because so-called anarchists have done so many bombings and that type of thing, that being an anarchist is actually still illegal in many countries where it's not illegal to be a communist. It's actually quite perverse. But I wanted to cover that.
Yeah,
the number of laws, right? We're talking about the number of laws. Okay, so how many laws should you have? So the 10 Commandments, I can't name them right now. I'm not sure many people can. And it's a different list for Catholics and Protestants and all this. Let's not get off into the weeds there. But I'd say that's too many, because primitive people like to say 2, 3, many. They have trouble counting past 3. So a good reason to limit the number of laws so you can actually remember them. This stupid idea, ignorance of the law is no excuse. In today's world, that makes absolutely no rational sense, because you're ignorant of these thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of laws.
Unknowable.
Yeah, they're unknowable, actually. So how many laws should we have? Well, if the 10 Commandments, if you can't even remember them easily, then how many laws should you have? I'd say In an anarchic society, you'd basically only have two laws. One, do all that you say you're going to do. And two, don't aggress against other people or their property. Well, that's something a 6-year-old can remember those and almost innately understands those two laws. That's all you need to know. And a private court system, in other words, if you have a dispute with somebody, and disputes arise with differences of interpretation and so forth, okay, this is understandable. So you go to a private adjudication group or person, selected and agreed to by both people, and that's how you get the justice. Whereas today, with the state, you can't get into court with a tort, and once you get in, you can't get out, and it'll bankrupt you once you're in there. So it's completely perverse. In fact, I'd go even further, saying those two laws are really all you need. But if people are going to be truly responsible, there's really only one law. And this is like, this is my idea, I've got to say. I think it's original. I don't know. Maybe I heard it from somebody else and can't remember it. But just as physicists are trying to take the laws of the universe to one great law, I think that we can say that this is possible in the ethical and moral sphere. And I would say the one great law is this: the whole of the law is do as thou wilt, but be prepared to accept the consequences. Because in fact, everybody does do whatever the hell they want in the long run. Do what you want. You can't stop somebody from doing what they want. You can punish them for it. But the thing is, they don't think out the second part of that, but be prepared to accept the consequences.
Right.
And if people realize, yeah, wow, I really can do whatever I want. I mean, I can think of something as crazy, you can do it. But if you have to think out the consequences, it tends to make you more responsible. And you learn to think rationally. So it's actually quite destructive from both a moral and an intellectual point of view. We have these thousands of laws and people think, yeah, I'm okay, I'm obeying the law. No, you're not. You're being a complete moron. Better that there are no laws and you have to think out what the consequences of what you do are. That'll make you more responsible. And if you want to survive, it's going to tend to make you more ethical. So I don't know if I'm being clear or not. Do you think that?
No, I think you are. So, but the thing is that obviously that's you said that's those two laws and then narrowed down to your one is not in a utopian world, because that's a utopian world is not really feasible. Like everything's not going to work the way that, it's not going to be sunshine, rainbows, and unicorns no matter what in any environment. But I think that the question I have is that we obviously don't live in a world like that. And because of the psychological aberrations that people have, it's unlikely that we could ever live in a world like that, or there will ever be. But I guess I should ask you that question. Do you ever think is there an instance where somebody can live like that today? Is there any place, or is there any way you can conduct yourself so as to live as close to that ideal as possible?
Well, yeah, what's the freest country in the world?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. There's 200 more or less countries in the world. And frankly, I think this is a fact. For about the last 100 years, the trend has been towards less freedom all over the world. Why is that? I think it's because of the fact that democracy is worshipped it's a secular religion. Believing in democracy it's a secular religion. It's like a type of God. And the problem with democracy is you elect a legislature in all these countries, even make believe, like the Soviet Union. They had the Supreme Soviet and they were elected. It was all just make believe, but you know, it was democracy, they said. Democratic People's Republic of North Korea,
Right,
okay?
exactly.
Democratic People's Republic of China. So this whole idea of democracy is ridiculous. But what happens when you get a legislature sitting around? Well, they're supposed to pass laws. That's what they do, is pass laws. So every year you've got more and more and more laws, and they generally don't get rid of the past laws. They're still there to trap you if you're found to violate one of them. So actually, and since this is true all over the world, because every country has a legislature, I think I'm right, every one, and they all pass laws, the world is becoming less and less free, and has been for the last 100 years, since, you know, there are no more kings and princes. We're all democracies or republics or something like that. So yeah, the world's becoming less free. So where do you go based on that? Well, some places are better than others. Like at this moment, I'm speaking to you from Uruguay, which is a quiet, backward little country, low population, but has a high standard of living, despite its being backward. And I don't have to wear a mask when I go out in Uruguay. You know, I don't have, you know, they don't take a lot of this stuff very seriously. It's laid back. So I like a small, laid back country, not a large, highly regulated, tightly controlled country. I'm going back to the US in a few days, and I'm not looking forward to it. I really am not looking forward to it, because the US is efficient and Uruguay is not efficient, which is nice. And if I violate some law, social distance, not wearing a mask in the right places, God knows what else there's going to be now. You know, the US is pretty efficient at rounding up people that don't follow their numerous laws. So I don't know where you go. I guess you go someplace that's quiet and has a background.
It's almost like
I don't know.
is inefficient and has a weaker enforcement arm of their government, regardless of their legislative body, right?
Yeah, a place that doesn't encourage people to be busybodies, to see something and say something. I mean, I hate snitches. I hate busybodies.
Well,
I'm sorry. You're not supposed to hate anybody today, incidentally, but I think hate's a perfectly legitimate emotion that there's a time and a place for everything.
Well, I think so too. And there's especially for a group of people who tend to attack their fellow man for you know, petty reasons, you know, is definitely worthy of hate, I think. So it seems to be like the whole you know, the busybodies and the snitches, like that idea, it seems like that is only something that's even possible in a really wealthy country where people have plenty of wealth and time, you know, where they can start to, they don't have to, they're not working maybe, you know, 12 hours a day. They have plenty of time to tell on their neighbor for, you know, not for violating some infraction somewhere.
That's right. And they have not been educated in basic ethics or rational thought, quite frankly. So they're basically like very intelligent chimpanzees, but they haven't been educated in these things. You know, the thing is that people, where do you get an ethical education in the United States today? Well, should you get it from a public school where the person is hired based upon having gotten a college degree, where he's been tutored in basically Marxism, cultural Marxism, by all the Marxist professors? Gee, I don't want to get an ethical education from a socialist or a Marxist, but that's where the kids get it in school. And the parents don't think about this type of thing very well at all. I mean, they really don't. So, okay, you go to your church or your synagogue, and well, you can argue about the ethics of these different religions. That's why they have religious wars with each other. What's morally right and wrong? Let's fight about it. So Americans don't get very, very confused messages of what's right and wrong, moral and immoral today. And so it would be nice if there was a place where you could, well, historically, that's what a liberal arts education was all about. It's what the type of thing that a person should know to be a free man. Liberal arts, a free man, got a liberal arts education. So this was things like philosophy were taught. You know, Socrates, I don't agree with all the things he and Plato said, but the method of talking these things out and asking questions and answering them, I mean, that's what a school should be about, on ethical and moral issues, which is what Socrates talked about. Not always the right take, in my opinion, but still, that was how you got an education. Today, if you have a liberal arts degree, chances are excellent. It's going to increasingly excellent. It's going to be in gender studies or political science, which is, you know, the science of telling other people what to do. It's not a science. So why do we call it political science? That's kind of a ridiculous upside down thing. Or sociology, which is, you know, treating people like animals, or you know, or psychology, which is all off on going in the wrong direction. I mean, most psychologists and psychiatrists I've ever run into are people that want to be that because it's pretty easy, either just sitting there and talking with somebody where you get to bounce your own psychological demons off against somebody who's paying you to do it, or in the case of a psychiatrist, passing out any of, well, there's well over 100 psychoactive drugs, all of them dangerous. I mean, you're going to get a moral education from those people? I think not, or you better not. So this is why I'm quite pessimistic about the way things are today. And anyway, getting back to what country should you go to? I guess you can go to if you're being treated as cattle by your government, which is the fact, they do treat you like cattle. The question is, do you want to be a feedlot cow or do you want to be a free range cow? Well, it's better to be a free range cow, but frankly, they all go to the same place. I mean, your government treats you as a milk cow, always with taxes. But if you're naughty or if you can't give milk anymore, they're going to treat you like a beef cow. And in the meantime, you're either feedlot or free range. So the whole way of looking at these things on the part of the average person is it's perverse.
So there's not really, there's not an anarchist view of politics would be to essentially opt out, wouldn't it? I mean, rather than, it seems like the Antifa type people who claim to be anarchists, they're trying to really seize control of the government to, you know, create their own rules essentially for everyone to follow. But a real anarchist, would they primarily just opt out? They would just look for ways to disassociate themselves from these regimes versus trying to change something?
Well, to me, Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher who's responsible for Daoism, he lived about the same time as Confucius, which coincidentally was about the same time as the Greek philosophers, 5th century BC. Rather odd that there was a real renaissance in thinking, both in the Orient and in Europe in the 5th century BC. What was going on? What was in the water in those places? But anyway, my ideal of a proper way to conduct yourself as an anarchist is Lao Tzu. And from that point of view, anarchism is the kindest and gentlest and not violent. I mean, it's the gentlest of philosophy. It's the watercourse way, where everything flows to its own level, at its own pace, in its own time. So I'm a big fan of Daoism and Lao Tzu. He was probably the first outspoken anarchist. So I'm
I
very
don't.
sympathetic too.
I think
Very
very few
sympathetic to
people would
Taoism.
associate Taoism with anarchy, but I really think that or with anarchism. But I think that's I love thinking about it like that because it plants a totally different seed in people's minds. They think of these black bloc Antifa kids, these thugs, and they don't think at all of peace and harmony and freedom, which is really what it's associated with.
Yes, exactly. I mean, try to put yourself in the where is a proper fictional image that I can bring up of a Taoist. Well, that old series Kung Fu. I think the monks in the monastery were Kwai Chang Caine, I think was his name, was accepted into. Uh, I suspect that was a Taoist monastery, quite frankly.
Mm.
They were thoughtful, peaceful, but they weren't pacifists. They were, pushed. They would defend themselves. So,
Mm. So if there's the cornerstone of all this though is personal responsibility, and you have to I think you have to recognize that when you are clamoring for the state to take action, you are in essence offloading your personal responsibility. And you're feeling like that's a better choice. Because I like thinking of it like that, because I think that most people, a lot of conservatives especially, like they like to think that they're very focused on personal responsibility, very focused on that. And that's really important. And yet they they have this big blind spot to the offloading of a huge swath of responsibilities, and really believe that the state is an important actor here, and the state is doing good in this case.
yes, you're absolutely right. In other words, they're equating responsibility with following laws.
Hmm.
But there are scores of thousands of laws. That's not responsible. It's the opposite of responsibility to blindly follow thousands of laws.
Hmm.
So conservatives are their own worst enemy from that point of view. I
Hmm.
mean, conservatives, using today's definition, tend to be more rational, more logical, more reasonable than so-called liberals are today. I don't like the word conservative because what does that mean? Conservative. It means you conserve. You keep what you're given. I'll do it that way because that's what my mommy and daddy taught me.
Hmm.
I will. That's what a conservative is. Well, look, I'm a cultural conservative. I don't want to see society upturned on its end, which implies violence and so forth. But I certainly don't like the idea of conservatism, where you just keep what you have because it's there. I mean,
Hmm.
you should keep what you have. That's good. And that does not include the scores of thousands of idiotic laws passed by these aberrated idiots that are drawn to go into politics.
Right. And also, a lot of times conservatives get this mixed up with their, the conserving this idea of America and its imperial policing function, that like its status among other nations must, also be conserved. We must have, constantly update our, our our Navy, for instance. We got to spend trillions of dollars on that to upgrade that stuff, because to maintain some sort of status in the world, we have to conserve that.
Yes, it's crazy. It's one reason why the liberals are dysfunctional and the conservatives are dysfunctional, and they're both acting to destroy uh, the idea of America. I don't even say what I'm referring to, the geographical area of the United States. I don't call it America anymore because America is an idea.
Mm.
But I'm afraid that over time, America, the idea, has ceased to exist. So it's been replaced by the United States, which is just another of the 200 nation states that cover the face of the globe like a skin disease at this point.
Right. And so one can have, I mentioned this earlier, loyalty to the idea, the ideals of associate with America. You could have that pride of association with that, but still have a disdain for government. And I think that people can't, people have a hard time, separating those two. One is a nation, a culture, a people, a society and relationships with the state.
You're absolutely right. People conflate the US government with the idea of America. They are two totally different things. In fact, I would go so far as to say they're often, usually, antithetical to each other. But people think the US government, being loyal to the US government, is the same as being loyal to America. It's not. I mean, when the Soviets conquered Russia under Lenin, if you were loyal to the government, were you being loyal to Mother Russia? I think not. When Hitler took over Germany, were you being loyal to the country of Beethoven and no, you weren't. You were betraying it by being loyal to the government. So especially after this election, God, I mean, whichever party wins, it's going to be chaos, not anarchy, chaos. And whichever party wins, they're going to clamp down on the miscreants from the other party. This is a scary time we're going into. No wonder I don't want to go back to the U.S. right now.
No, well, I'm glad you came back, because I'm sure we'll be able to do one of these in person, which would be nice. But I think that the maybe the positive side, if there is one, is that the economic situation. You talked about one of the challenges with being in the U.S. is that it's so efficient, as compared to Uruguay, which might have a bunch of silly laws, but really they just they don't have the will or the wherewithal really to enforce those laws to the same degree. And so maybe it just makes living a little easier, a little freer.
Actually, the truth be known, Matt, I actually prefer Argentina to Uruguay because neither one of them take their laws very seriously, but Argentina is very, very corrupt. And if you violate a law, it's nothing that, a small packet of bills can't. Here in Uruguay, it's probably the least corrupt country in Latin America. One of the least corrupt countries in the world, actually. So if you do violate a law, you're probably going to have to answer for it, as opposed to just pay the cop off like you do in Mexico, for instance, which is also notoriously corrupt.
I see. And people immediately, reflexively, I'm sure the response to that is, well, I mean, that's corrupt to be able to, pay your way out of an infraction in the law. But if, again, if laws aren't if that's only if you assume laws are innately just and innately ethical, right?
Exactly. Get back to the idea of the two great laws. Do all that you say you're going to do, and don't aggress against other people or their property. So when I'm going 10 kilometers over the speed limit, am I violating one of those laws? I'd say the answer is no. Also, talking about cops and speed laws, I mean, I think the cops actually cause more accidents than they prevent, because everybody's gotten into the habit of slavishly watching their speedometer or slavishly having to watch the rearview mirror to see if some cop is coming up to harass them for God knows what. Anyway.
There's a lot of evidence that things like red light cameras, which, issue citations, when people run a red light, that those do increase accidents in intersections, because people are worried about, worried about getting a ticket. So they'll slam on their brakes too aggressively, and cause rear end collisions and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of evidence. It's, the laws, they cause second order effects that people don't, that aren't obvious at first. They're only obvious over time, and if they bother to measure them. So but the really last thing I really want to understand, I guess, is if you're an anarchist, though, and I know that you think this election is really important, and yet, this basically your political philosophy is that you want no rule, no ruler. The government serves no useful purpose anyway. How do you reconcile in yourself that idea? Like, what do you do? I mean, how do you handle this?
Look, it doesn't matter who wins. The American people are going to be losers, because both sides are going to use it as an excuse to crack down more. So you're right. It's just that at this point, I feel that the Democrats have a lot more Looney Tunes type people that are in charge of that party than the Republicans do. I mean, the Republicans are hypocrites and they're ineffectual, and there's all kinds of problems with the Republicans and conservatives, but they are not as aggressive at this point as the Democrats are. So I'll take 4 years of purgatory as opposed to perhaps 20 years of hell, because if the Democrats are elected, they're going to cement themselves in office by making Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. states, so they get 4 more senators and more electors in the Electoral College, and they'll pack the Supreme Court, and they'll put everybody through state education more than now, free college and this type of thing. So if the Democrats win, their bad ideas are going to be perpetuated for at least another generation. So look, I'm not political, and I don't want to get involved in good guys and bad guys, but I think the Republicans would be less damaging to the average American's freedom at this point. In the long run, though, the only thing that matters is, other than people understanding basic ethics, which I'm pessimistic about, is technology. Technology is what really changes the nature of life from day to day, and actually in many ways affects ethics and morality too, with what you can do with technological stuff.
Yeah,
So I don't want to give the false impression
that we're okay, that we'll be good to go if people just vote for Donald Trump.
No, we won't be. Yeah. No, we won't be.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to say that.
Yeah, I think we talked about this in a kind of offline conversation. It's just that it seems to me, at least during my lifetime, as I try and think and understand the trends, it's that the progressives, or what's considered the left, have basically really won the war of ideas, and that the conservatives are just trying to hold back the slide toward this statism, that's basically been occurring, and so maybe the conservatives, they do continue to hold it back a little bit versus just letting the dam go free, letting the water flow freely.
Yeah, but they don't do it on strong ethical, moral arguments. They do it from practical kind of arguments, which doesn't cut it. So they look like hypocrites because they are generally.
Well, and I mean, if you're not guided fundamentally, we come back to this over and over, by some philosophy, some moral compass, then you end up making these compromised, pragmatic decisions along the way. And I just feel like there's the reason why things are moving in this direction is because there just isn't a competing side. There isn't a different set of ideas that are on par with the idea of socialism, the idea of these collectivists. We're not even competing. I mean, there's not even a competing idea.
You're right. Socialism and communism are secular religions, and people like to have something to believe in. And, socialism and collectivism pass for religions. So of course they go for that.
Well, all right, Doug, thank you very much.
Listen, I wanted to recommend a couple of books.
I was just going to ask you to do that, actually. Yeah.
And I think that David Friedman, he's the son of Milton, his book, Machinery of Freedom, is very good about this type of thing, anarchy, how it would work. But better than that, and free on the internet, is, I think it's on Mises.org website, but I think you can just Google
this, I think.
Yeah, it's The Market for Liberty by Linda and Morris Tannehill. And that book actually crystallized and changed my thinking. I don't know if I ever told you how that happened.
No.
It's interesting. That book was published in Samizdat Forum back in, when was that? About 1970, 71, something like that. And I got a hold of a copy. I was given a copy of it by a libertarian friend, which there were very few back then, The Market for Liberty. And I went on a treasure hunting expedition for 3 months back then, believe it or not. And I read the book and I realized that I had not, it's a brilliant book. It shows exactly how society would work if it was an anarchy. Never once uses the word anarchy in the whole book. So anyway, here's what happens. The treasure hunting boat, which was a minesweeper, like the one that Jacques Cousteau used, except it looked more like a target drone than Jacques Cousteau's boat, but another story. It got sunk. And that book, The Market for Liberty, went to the bottom with the, what do we call that? What was that boat called? The Fathom, I guess it was called. And so anyway, there it was. And it was about just before I had tremendous good luck with my first financial book, Crisis Investing. And in the back of that, it was a huge bestseller, sold many hundreds of thousands of copies and all this type of thing. And in the back, I mentioned this book really, really strongly. And also a bookstore, Laissez-Faire Books in New York, where they could get it. Or I thought they could get it, because that's where I was told my friend that gave it to me got it from. Only 500 copies were printed. So they got thousands of requests for this book because it was in the back of my book. But it wasn't in print. So entrepreneurially, Andrea Rich, who ran the company, it was her company, put it back in print and asked me to write the foreword for the book that changed my life. So it was kind of a back to the future kind of thing. I get to write the foreword later on for the book that changed my life before. And incidentally, the introduction was written by my old friend, Carl Hess, who we might have mentioned, who coined who's Goldwater's speechwriter. And Carl was an early anarchist too. And I love Carl. He coined the phrase, moderation in defense of liberty is
extremism in defense of liberty.
Yeah. Anyway, it was a real back to the future type of thing. But it's free on the internet. Everybody should read that book. It's well written.
I did not understand that you ended up writing the foreword for that. That's such an amazing.
That's how it happened.
That's beautiful.
That's how it happened. They asked me to do that. So
wow. Well, I honestly I haven't read it, so that's what I'm going to be doing over the next evening anyway. I'm going to get.
Oh, you're in for a treat. I promise you. I hope everybody that's listening to this reads it.
All right, I will. Awesome, Doug. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you again soon.